Nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we're back with another episode of Way of the Underhive. This series is dedicated to helping brand new players to Necromunda build their starting rosters and learn more about the game mechanics of their favorite gangs. And on today's episode, we will be discussing Wyrd Powers introduced by the various editions of Necromunda. We'll discuss each Wyrd Power in detail, give our thoughts of the abilities, and explain how it can be used to help you to achieve victory in your next battle report. So these next few series of videos, we're going to get kind of weird. We're going to be talking about Psykers and their roles in Necromunda. We'll also give you a little bit of a briefing of what the Psyker rules detail in this game setting. We'll also talk about in quite a bit all the Wyrd powers that are available in Necromunda as well. We'll talk about each one of those individual abilities and how best to use those in your campaigns and as well as your games on the tabletop. We'll also provide our conclusive thoughts on what we think about this Wyrd power set. And because this video will be a little bit more of a deeper dive, I will put timestamps in the description box down below so that we can click and navigate to the part of the video that interests you the most. So that being said, let's talk about Wyrd powers. Alright, so give you the rundown real fast of Psykers in Necromunda. First of all, willpower characteristic is going to be key because the lower the willpower score is for your character, the easier it's going to be for them in order to trigger these mental abilities off. Think of it, you can basically take 2d6 and you got to either match or beat the willpower score for your character. Now, about a 7+ willpower is going to basically give you a 50-50 odds of whether you can get your Wyrd powers off or not. You want to be more like in the 6, the 5, the 4 levels, so that way you can continually get your Wyrd powers off, statistically speaking, at a higher level. And of course, if you can't get that low with your willpower scores to either upgrading your character, you could also do so with some very simple actions you can take in the actual tabletop to help you. For example, every single one of these characters do come with the power called Maintain Control. It is a simple action and it's used for continuous effect Wyrd powers that you might use. All you gotta do, of course, is take a willpower test with a 3+ modifier attached to it. If you manage to beat that score, of course, the ability still keeps on going, otherwise it immediately ends. At the same time, if you do need a little bit of boost to your willpower test, you can take a concentrate action with your Psykers, and what that basically is a basic action that adds +1 to your willpower test the next time you roll it. At the same time, you do have to watch out for Perils of the Warp. If you manage to roll Snake Eyes when you roll for your powers, there's a couple of bad things that can happen to your characters, kind of like miscasting for your magic in Warhammer the Old World. At the same time, if you have rival Psykers in the opposing gang, of course, all they gotta do is roll 2d6 as well and beat your willpower test. And they're able to do so, that means they disrupt your power and your ability doesn't go off either. Now, when it comes to the Perils of the Warp, however, like I said before, double ones is the way you actually trigger that event, and it can actually be quite devastating for your Psykers. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail here in a second. Lastly, you have two types of Psykers in your gangs. You have a sanctioned Psyker, which is nice because you get to re-roll 1 willpower test per battle, which could be extremely useful. Having that ability to re-roll could prove quite critical if the situation warrants it. Also, you have for most of your fighters, you'll have what's called the non-sanctioned Psyker special rule, which means if your character gets taken out of action, your opponent earns D3 times 10 credits in order to do so because, you know, they're wanted, dead or alive, basically. And if they get captured, they can be immediately sold if captured as well, so you won't be able to get them back in a rescue mission if that does happen. And lastly, the coolest thing about these game mechanics, of course, is your Psyker's ability to access force weapons. Force weapons are actually just normal mundane melee weapons, but if a post-battle action where you do a sign attunement, if you actually pass that roll, you could actually add the power trait as well as a sever trait to your force weapons, and that only works in the hands of a Psyker. So for those of you guys who are looking for some ways to make your Psykers even deadlier, may I suggest giving them force weapons. Alright, so let's talk about Perils of the Warp. Whenever you roll double ones or a double 6 when making a willpower test to perform a Wyrd power action, you might actually get the Perils of the Warp, right? So let's go and talk about what that ends up being. You end up rolling a 2d6 and you get one of basically 5 possibilities. If you roll a 2 to 3, you get what's called a tear in reality, and what that rule states is that the Psyker loses control and warp energy tears reality apart around them. Center a 5-inch blast marker on the Psyker. Any model touched by the marker must pass a willpower test or lose a wound or suffer driver wounded effect, and the Psyker then goes out of action. On a 4 through 5, you have the Immaterium inverse. The warps inverts upon the attempting to control it, the Psyker becomes a target of power regardless of range. If the power is beneficial, the Psyker instead becomes prone and pinned and suffers a strength 6 hit that inflicts 2 damage, ignoring armor saves, and the power has no further effects. On a roll of 6 or 8, you get Whispers of the Warp. The Psyker's mind is filled with screaming demonic voices. The Psyker becomes subject to the Insane condition. Place an insanity marker on the Psyker's fighter card and roll d6 on the Insane table when they activate. On a 9 through 10, you get Warp Surge. The Psyker's power becomes overcharged with warp energy. The Psyker may immediately try to manifest the same power again as a free action, or if they're trying to disrupt the power, they may immediately manifest one of their own powers as a free action. This additional manifestation of the power can trigger Perils of the Warp as normal. After working out the effects of the power, the Psyker becomes prone and pinned and suffers a strength 4 hit, which inflicts 1 damage. And lastly, from 11 through 12, you have Demonic Possession. Demonic energy courses through the Psyker's body. The Psyker increases their movement, strength, toughness, as well as attack characteristics all by 3, and their weapon skill to 2+. The unarmed attacks inflict 2 damage and have an AP of -1. In the end phase of the following round, or if the Psyker generates this result again, they go out of action. So as you can see, some pretty crazy things can happen with Perils of the Warp as well. It triggers either on a double 1 or double 6 when you're actually trying to do willpower tests before Wyrd Power, or when attempting to disrupt a Wyrd Power. So psychic abilities are quite nice, but player beware, there are some consequences if you mess up. Alright, so let's go and talk about the Biomancy Discipline. It is an interesting discipline which focuses primarily on the Psyker, so most of the abilities that they get off actually just affects the individual fighter. They got some really good buffs as well as really good boosts to the characteristics of your Psyker as well. There isn't really much in terms of how you can boost the effects of other people. You only have really one power that actually does that. The rest of it just pretty much stays with the individual Psyker. And you do have a range attack, which is also kind of nice, and that one group buff is quite good and helping remove flesh wounds as well as healing your fighters as well. Now, in my opinion, the Psyker, the Biomancy Discipline basically focuses the most of its efforts on creating a combat Psyker build. So this is a Psyker that you're planning on using, doing either a lot of close quarters combat, or using it for close combat, or maybe like even shooting. This character is going to be definitely taking the offense, and that's the way to kind of look at it when you look at Biomancy, especially with some of the ways that the powers are used in order to help boost up your Psyker and make him even a deadlier opponent. So if you decide to actually specialize directly into Biomancy, you get a special ability called the Biomancer special ability, and it's called Fast Healing. And it says when this fighter makes a recovery test, roll an extra die or injury dice, then choose which one to discard. Now, your Psyker is going to be a target. They're just going to be that. That's just the way it's going to be, especially if they are a Biomancer as well. So because of that, this will help you stay in the fight longer. And the reason why is because you are making a combat-oriented Psyker if you decide to take the Biomancer discipline on that one. And having the ability to actually choose an injury dice in case you lose your last wound is kind of a big deal. So that way you can either take a flesh wound or, a serious injury, anything to avoid being taken out of action. Now, it's not much, but it is something that can help your combat level Psyker stay a little bit stay alive even longer. So that's something to keep in mind if you decide to advance directly into Biomancy alone. So the special abilities talked about, let's talk about the individual powers. So the first one's called Arachnosis. It is a basic action to cast this with a continuous effect. The Wyrd's hand grows tiny serrated hairs along their palms, allowing them to cling to any surface with ease. While this Wyrd power is maintained, the fighter counts as having the Clamber, Catfall, and Mighty Leap skills. See the Necromunda rulebook. So if you want to live out your Spider-Man fantasies, this is the best way in order to do so. Having that ability to Clamber, which means you can treat vertical distances as horizontal distances, so you can move up your maximum movement allowance, having the ability to catfall between different levels and be safe, at the same time adding some additional length to your leaps between catwalks and different floors is an amazing ability to have. It's actually really good to buff your individual movement as a fighter, and having those abilities to do that, to climb vertical surfaces, to drop between levels and jump gaps, is a great way to get your fighter into the action as well. And like I said before, it's really good to use in Sector Mechanicus as well as Zone Mortalis environments for the most part, where there is a lot of vertical movement on the tabletop for that. Same thing with the Underhive campaign as well. It could be really good for that. Ash Waste, it's kind of dependent because you're not very many structures out in the Ash Waste, but it can still be useful as well in order to do that. And like I said, if you're planning on making a Biomancer Psyker, you're planning on using this person for combat, so being able to move across the battlefield very quickly is a good way to use this ability. Power number 2 is Chameleon. It is a basic action with a continuous effect, and it says the weird skin molts and shifts through a range of hues until it matches their surroundings, make them all but invisible. While this weird power is maintained, range attacks targeting their fighter suffers a -2 modifier to their hit roll, provided the fighter does not move during their activation. Now this is a decent enough power because it pretty much fulfills the same abilities as a Chameleon Cloak in that your opponents suffer -2 hit against you. But the problem though is that you have to stay stationary for that to work. So that's one of the problems that you kind of run into using this power, because it's kind of situational. Because if you're making a combat style Psyker, moving is going to be very important for you. So staying stationary isn't really advantageous to you. The way I see using this Chameleon ability is if you're making a combat fighter, let's say you get in charge in close combat, you defeat somebody, and your opponents are defeated. But on your next activation though, your fighter is out in the open. You could use Chameleon in order to protect them so that way they don't get shot at. So for example, you can move real quick with a simple action, then cast Chameleon so that way they're protected. And that would be the way I'd probably use this power if you're making a combat Psyker. Your third power is Cause Pain, which is also a basic action to cast. It says, with a twist of their hand, the Wyrd causes their foe to double over in unspeakable agony. Choose an enemy fighter that's already lost at least 1 wound, or suffered at least 1 flesh wound, and is within 18 inches of the line of sight of this fighter. That fighter must roll an injury dice and immediately apply the effects. So having the 18-inch range attack is actually quite great because it automatically causes an injury die roll is what it does. However, the target needs to be either wounded or has a flesh wound at least. And now, people might say that's kind of rough because, it only targets specific types of fighters and it's very situational, but it's an automatic hit. You're not using the Psyker's Ballistic skill in order to do this, and at the same time, making an opponent roll an injury dice 18 inches away is always useful because either one, you'll put another flesh wound on them, make them easier to wound. 2, you can put a serious injury on them, which means that kind of renders them inactive so they can't take anything on the battlefield, or you have a 1 in 6 chance of putting them out of action, which is always a good thing as well. So a pretty decent ranged attack, especially since you don't have to worry about using the ballistic skill of the Psyker in order to trigger this ability. Power number 4 is Stop Bleeding. It is a basic action to cast this ability, and it says, focusing their power on a wounded ally, the Wyrd closes up their wounds. Choose a friendly fighter that has suffered at least 1 flesh wound, and that is within 18 inches and line of sight of this fighter. This fighter immediately removes any flesh wounds they currently have. So this is actually a really nice ability to help out fighters who take a lot of flesh wounds. As you guys know, flesh wounds are the bane of a fighter's existence because it makes it easier to wound for one, and at the same time, it kind of hinders your abilities, to take chances with these guys. However, if you use this ability, especially if they're 18 inches away, you remove all of the flesh wounds, which would be absolutely fantastic to do that. It's really good to use on fighters like for brutes, for example, who will take a lot of hits. Same thing with multi-wounded fighters, fighters with multiple wounds. That could also be good for them. Plus, that 18-inch range is really nice. That way, if you want to keep your Biomancer in the back, they can start healing their friends who are up in the front lines and taking some of the damage that's taking place. So it's one of the most powerful abilities in this discipline. Power number 5 is the Quickening. It is a basic action to cast this ability with a continuous effect. The Wyrd pours psychic energy into their muscles, greatly increasing their reflexes. While this Wyrd power is maintained, improving the fighter's movement characteristic by 3 inches and their weapon skill, ballistic skill, initiative characteristics by 1 to a maximum of +2. It's a great power, really, to boost your psychic stat lines, especially if you're going to make him a combat level fighter. So having 3 inches added to your movement is fantastic. Same thing with that additional +1 weapon skill and ballistic skill. You never know when that would come in handy. +1 initiative is also great too in case you have to worry about taking initiative tests like trying to escape or retreat, or if you're going to fall off a building or a vehicle or something like that. It's a great general purpose ability to have for your Psyker, and also increases them as well. And if you're making your Psyker a combat Psyker, which you really should do with the Biomancy Discipline, this could really work wonders for you. Especially if you cast this in conjunction with Arachnosis, you'll be able to move across the battlefield no problem and cause all kind of issues for your enemy. So, really powerful ability. Now the very last power is Iron Arm, which is a basic action to cast, which also got a continuous effect. And it reads, with the thought, the Wyrd turns the flesh of their arm to unyielding iron, allowing them to block any blow directed at them. While this Wyrd power is maintained, the fighter gains a special 5+ save against attacks made against them in close combat. This save may be made after any save rolls for armor and not modified by armor piercing. Having a 5-up ward save in close combat is amazing, alright? Not alone just the regular armor that you have, but you have this as a backup, especially if you're dedicated in close combat. This is why I believe that the Biomancy Discipline is really geared towards a combat Psyker build who could really engage in close combat or at least close quarters battle, so that way you can keep your fighter alive and give you an extra save as your Psyker. And like I said before, it's a 5-up ward save because it's not modified by AP, so that part is really great. Now, granted, it's very situational because you got to use this in close combat, but you know what? It's still a very nice buff, especially if you're making a Psyker that charges into close combat a lot, especially if you're using the Biomancy Discipline, so having that additional save is always a good thing. Now granted, that save is only in close combat, but it's still a really good save. So in conclusion, the Biomancy Discipline is really geared for your close combat Psyker build. So this is a person that you're probably going to add that Psi attunement to your weapon to give it like a power type stat, for example. Get them into close combat, attacking people, or at least close quarters battle where they're actually shooting at short distances to their enemies as well. There's a lot of nice combat buffs that can be used for your fighter individually, and there's also a little bit of a nice healing buff as well to help remove flesh wounds as well as wounds from your opponents. Sorry, not from your opponents, from your friends as well, which is all kind of nice. Now, like I said before, the Biomancer Discipline is primarily focused on the individual Psyker, with only one power helping out friendly fighters, so this is only really good really to make your fighter into a better combatant, really, with some healing on top of that as well. After all, if you're going to just take the Biomancy Discipline to heal other people, I mean, that also still works as well. It just kind of depends on what you're trying to accomplish with your Psyker and what you want to do on the tabletop as well. Now, at the same time, if I basically had to rank the powers and the best all the way to the least, I would say Cause Pain is probably the best one to go with, just because of the 18-inch attack that could put a injury die on somebody, which is great. Now, granted, they have to have either a flesh wound or a wound in order to do so, but it's still an automatic hit that's going to cause an injury right off the bat, and you really can't argue with the results of being able to do that. Stop Bleeding is probably the second best power to take, so that way you can heal up your fellow fighters with wounds or with flesh wounds as well, which is a nice thing to use for that. After that, I would say the Quickening is also another really great power. It's a great general purpose ability to boost your movement, your weapon skill, your ballistic skill, as well as your initiative. It also helps out that combat build that you need. Arachnosis will probably be the next power after that, so that way you can climb across vertical surfaces and transition across the battlefield very quickly, especially if you're playing in Sector Mechanicus or in the Zone Mortalis or in the Underhive. That's a really good power to have. Iron Armor is pretty good as well too, just because you got that 5-up ward save in close combat. Now granted, it only works in close combat, but if you're building a combat Psyker anyways, you're going to be in close combat, so having that additional 5-up save is really helpful. And probably the least useful of these abilities is probably Chameleon, just because you can achieve the same results with a Chameleon Cloak. It doesn't take up a slot for your psychic abilities. It's very situational how you could probably use it. Don't get me wrong, it's a good power and you could use it to protect your Psyker from being shot at, but it's kind of limited what it can do. So there you guys have it. This is my viewpoints on the Biomancy Discipline for your games of Necromunda. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blog.com for all this greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this week, guys. I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace out and stay classy.